Hey listeners, I'm Hallie,
And I'm Brittany.
and thank you for tuning into The Abyss.
Don't forget to subscribe if you like what we do here so you'll never miss an episode.
Today we're going to be talking about a really weird case that keeps you on the edge of your seat. There's a bunch of twists and turns, and it's all about a man named Charles Morgan. He gets involved in some really weird stuff that leaves investigators speechless.
So let's jump into it. Charles Morgan was a super smart guy. He was very financially minded and things like that came easy to him. So by 39, he was actually the president of his own escrow agency. So if you don't know what an escrow agent is, basically when two parties are working on like a real estate deal or something like that, a lot of times someone will hold the assets or the money so both parties can have kind of an unbiased like third party that'll hold that property or hold the asset until an agreement has been reached. In addition to his own escrow agency, he was also married to the love of his life, Ruth, and they had 2 daughters together.
As you can imagine, being the president of an escrow agency at the age 39 is a lot of responsibility and a lot of stress. And sometimes people get wrapped up in things that might not be the best situation. It was actually known that Charles Morgan was a potential witness in a state land fraud case involving a known crime boss. So he had some interactions with people who may not have been the best. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can imagine how kind of small things can add up like that. You know, you just do a little bit here and a little bit there, and then all of a sudden you're wrapped up in something pretty big and scary.
Yeah, and that's kind of where this case goes with Morgan. On March 22nd in 1977, in Tucson, Arizona, Morgan left home in the morning to take his 2 daughters to school, and then all of a sudden he vanished. After dropping off his daughters, no one saw or heard from him for 3 days.
And his wife, Ruth, was trying to get the police involved, trying to, do everything she could to find him, but they weren't too concerned about it. We hear about that a lot. It's an adult. Maybe he just went off.
He's a 40-year-old man, almost 40-year-old man. So when he did show up 3 days later, at 2 o'clock in the morning to his home, his wife, Ruth, said that he was in a very weird state. He was missing a shoe. He had a plastic handcuff around one of his ankles, and his hands were tied together with plastic handcuffs. So not real ones, something you think a grown man would be able to break, get out of pretty easily, but he seemed to feel like he still had to wear them. I don't know why. He also was saying that he wasn't able to speak, so he would write down what he was telling his wife. He told her that he was kidnapped and tortured, and he wrote that there was a hallucinogenic drug that was painted on the inside of his throat that would either kill him or make him go insane. Now, when I first heard this, I was like, this guy has to be on something because he seems way far out there right now.
Yeah, and I did some research on what the drug could have been, and I really couldn't find anything that would have done what he said it did, and was administered that way. You have to kind of think that maybe that was just a fear tactic, but he was scared enough and, had been through enough that he believed that, like, fully.
Yeah, he had asked his wife to go outside and move his car because he didn't want them to know that he had returned home. He wouldn't say who the them was, but just referred to it as them. And he also told her not to call the police because a hit would be put on their family. Now, if he's believing all of this, that's terrifying. But as his wife, I would be more concerned about his health at the moment. I would think, what is wrong with my husband? Now, I know I keep mentioning that it sounds like maybe he was on some drugs that made him hallucinate or imagine certain things, but Chuck actually believed this and didn't speak for a week following this incident, and Ruth would give him water with an eyedropper for a week so that way he could have some type of sustenance before he could speak again.
Yeah, Ruth was really a trooper. She just rolled with the punches with this and nursed him back to health. And
I know, definitely call the police.
Yeah.
I'd be like, something is wrong, we're going to the doctor.
So in the notes that he wrote to his wife during the time that he couldn't speak, he told her that he was missing his Treasury ID, which she didn't know anything about, but pretty much insinuated that he was an agent for the federal government.
Yeah, which just goes more to show that he could be tied up in things that aren't the best situation.
So after this whole incident, Chuck was really, really paranoid. He was always looking over his shoulder. He wore a bulletproof vest all the time.
Those things cannot be comfortable too.
Yeah, Kevlar is heavy. And he started driving his daughters to and from school, and he told the school that no one else could pick them up, that just him. He was the only one that could drive his family around and do things like that. He was really scared. And he told his father that if anything happened to him, that there was a letter that explained everything and would, name the perpetrator and all this stuff, but no evidence of that has been found.
They never found any letters or anything. So 2 months after the initial incident where he came home, talked about this drug in his throat, being kidnapped, he actually disappeared again.
Charles Morgan was a Freemason, which is a fraternal order in the U.S. The night he went missing again, he was planning on attending a Masonic meeting, but he never actually made it there.
And then 9 days after his disappearance, there was an anonymous phone call from a woman to Charles' wife, Ruth, and she said, quote, "Chuck is all right, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Ecclesiastes 12 is a chapter in the Bible with the verses 1-8 being specified. It's kind of a lengthy read. We won't read it all right here, but we will tell you kind of an interpretation of it that we saw online, where the verses that were indicated by this woman basically talk about going from youthfulness to being an elder, and how you start to struggle because your weaknesses are becoming more prominent. You're losing all the strengths that you once had. So you're losing your ability to see as well. Your teeth may be falling out. Your hair is graying. You're losing the ability to hear as well. And so basically that part of the Bible is talking about losing that spring in your step before you die and how life would be miserable without heaven. So she didn't really explain anything further after saying this. She just hung up on the phone. Ruth didn't know who this woman was, and she reported this to the police.
So that's super cryptic and hard to tell what that had to do with his disappearance, why she felt that was significant enough that she had to actually call his wife, and it's just such a mysterious character in this whole story.
Not to mention that if you go and look up this Bible verse, it's very poetic and very metaphorical. So for her to read this after getting that call, I guarantee she looked it up because, she's been missing her husband. She was probably really confused, thinking, what is going on?
And if I remember correctly, Ruth was very religious, right? She was very devoted.
Yeah.
So 2 days after this mysterious call, on June 18th, 1977, Charles was found shot to death in the desert. He had a single gunshot to the back of his head, and he was still wearing his bulletproof vest. He even had a belt buckle with a knife hidden, and he had a holster on his belt too. It was determined that the bullet was from his own .357 Magnum. The gun was lying right beside him, and there was gunshot residue on his left hand, but mysteriously enough, he was actually right-handed.
Yeah, and I know one of our friends mentioned that sometimes people shoot with their opposite hand when they go hunting, but there was no gunshot residue on his right hand.
To make matters way weirder, there were no fingerprints on the gun at all.
Yeah, so if he did shoot himself, they would either see a glove on his hand, a napkin or something wrapped around the gun, or the gun would have been wiped down by someone else. There's no way that they wouldn't have known that it was him. He had been dead for 12 hours when they found him. So it wasn't like this was right off the bat. Whoever did it had plenty of time to flee if it was a murder. Inside of his car was even more interesting. They found a note that had directions to the crime scene written in his handwriting. That kind of tells me that maybe someone was telling him where to meet and he was writing it down really quick on a piece of paper or napkin or whatever it was written on.
Yeah, because if he was just driving out into the desert, why would he need an exact location, and why would he need to write it down? It's just a super weird piece of the case.
The desert in Arizona.
Yeah.
There were also several weapons in his car and a cache of ammunition. There was a CB radio and a pair of sunglasses that didn't belong to him. The car had been altered also so that it could be unlocked from the fender. Furthermore, there was one of his teeth that had been wrapped in a handkerchief and left in the car. That part is really weird. You know, someone removed his tooth, or he removed his own tooth and just wrapped it up and put it in the car.
Yeah, and going back to him saying he had been tortured previously, that kind of seems potentially like a part of that or something to do with that.
Yeah. To make matters even more suspicious, on Morgan's body, clipped to the inside of his underwear, was a $2 bill. So $2 bills are kind of rare anyway.
And at that point, I think I read they had been discontinued in the 60s, but in 1977, they had actually been reissued. So,
oh, very cool. I didn't know that. So maybe they were kind of common. He just had a $2 bill.
It's hard to say.
On that $2 bill, he had 7 Spanish names listed from the letters A to G, as well as having Ecclesiastes written with the number 12 below it. And on the bill's serial number, he had put an arrow on the numbers 1 and 8. Now, if you remember when that woman called his wife Ruth, she said Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 8. So it's very peculiar that this was also on the $2 bill attached to the inside of Charles' underwear. Also, there was a crude map drawn showing several roads between Tucson, Arizona, and the Mexican border. And the towns that were identified on the map were apparently known for smuggling. This kind of points again to like maybe something deeper was going on.
Yeah. So 2 days after they found his body, the same anonymous woman who had spoken to Chuck's wife actually spoke to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. She called them up and said she had met Chuck in a motel shortly before he died. She didn't say her name, but she just gave them the moniker Green Eyes. In this call, she told the police that Charles Morgan had showed her a briefcase with several $1,000s that were meant to buy him out of a gang contract that had been put on his life. One source stated that the contract on his life was about 90 grand, and each day it was increasing by another 5 grand. So if you believe that, then it could really...
There was a big hunt for him.
Somebody really wanted him gone.
And this money was never found, right?
Right. And interestingly, I did a little bit of research on this too, and another infamous gangster, Whitey Bulger, actually used to run this con where he would go to someone and tell them there was a contract on his life and say, the contract's for 50 grand, but if you give us 60 grand, then we'll make it go away. People would just pay it, even though there was never a contract. It was all a con. You know, it was just an extortion thing. So
was that during this time period?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That kind of made me think of that because the money was missing, even though it was said that if this woman's to be believed that maybe somebody took the money. Maybe the hitman, maybe it was a real hit, and the hitman was like, hey, if you give me this money, you know, I'll call it off. And then he just paid himself twice, basically.
That's cool. I didn't read that anywhere. That's awesome. 3 weeks after his death, 2 men actually went by his house and claimed to be FBI agents. And they told Ruth that they needed to search the place. And they ended up like tearing the house apart and searched for a long time. It is unknown if they found anything they were looking for or if they were even real FBI agents. Don Devereaux, a journalist who had started looking into the Charles Morgan case, contacted the FBI, and they had no knowledge of a Charles Morgan. That is super fishy.
Yeah, because either they're covering up something really big or somebody else is.
Yeah, either they found something, didn't say anything, and want to pretend like they were never there.
Which has happened.
Or they weren't the FBI.
Which has also happened. Weirdly enough, on August 10th, 1977, authorities actually ruled Morgan's death a suicide, which is just...
That's so crazy.
Yeah. No fingerprints on the gun, and a gunshot to the back of the head is such an awkward way. There's so many much more easy ways to do that, and that's just with your non-dominant hand in the back of your head. That's such a weird thing.
And there's so many discrepancies.
And we know there's other people involved. This woman has called twice, and we know there's other players in this. So.
And the connection with the Bible verse, it was the same thing on his bill as she said. So
yeah,
clearly there was some connection going on.
The family and the reporter we mentioned, Devereaux, all thought pretty surely that he had been murdered.
Yeah, and it was later discovered that Chuck was heavily involved in money laundering activities through his Tucson escrow company. Do you want to kind of explain what money laundering is for people who may not know?
So most people have probably heard the term money laundering, but I think a lot of people might not know kind of all the ins and outs of it. I won't go too in depth, but there's a lot of different types of money laundering. Like the mafia and, criminals are getting money through kind of shady ways. They don't want to leave a trail of this money that leads back to them. They want to clean it, basically. One way they do this is by basically taking the cash that they have and running it through a business. So a lot of times you hear about laundromats or casinos, things like that are very cash heavy, and they'll kind of put the cash in because you can't trace cash as well, filter it through. So what comes out the other side is clean money. A lot of them have these businesses to filter the money through, and then the money just comes out as profits, even though sometimes they're barely offering the service they say they are, or sometimes it's sort of just a small part of what they do, and most of the cash is really coming from the criminal activity. In this case, because he was an escrow agent, Charles Morgan could really push around a lot of money at one time. Mm-hmm. So he could make up people that were doing real estate deals or things like that and put money away that had someone else's name tied to it, but it might not be real. Or for real deals, he could sort of overvalue. They put $100,000 down, he might put $120,000 in this account and sort of put a little extra in there, and then when it comes out the other side, it just looks like, a normal real estate deal or normal escrow deal.
Yeah, that makes sense. And going off of that, from 1973 until his death, it is known that he was involved in large underground gold and platinum trades. He received a lot of money from these activities, and some of the money was allegedly coming from regions such as Southeast Asia. And supposedly the American government, Vietnamese government, and some rogue CIA members were all involved in these trades.
Yeah, so there's a lot of high stakes things going on here. A lot of big organizations.
Big people.
Yeah, that really have a lot to sort of protect their own interests,
They have some high stakes going on.
Yeah. In addition to the money laundering we talked about, he was linked to some specific schemes involving fraudulent real estate, which is another common way of laundering money.
So among the people who were involved with these fraudulent real estates with Morgan were people from the Bonanno family, which were part of a mafia crew. So he was really getting involved with things that most of us would probably steer clear from. To make matters even worse, Devereaux, the journalist who was looking into the case extensively, discovered that Morgan had kept duplicate records of all of his illicit transactions. Now, this is some dangerous stuff. The whole purpose of money laundering is to prevent a trail, like you said, and he is making a trail.
Yeah, so that's definitely something worth killing for. If you're a mafia crew, I think they've killed for a lot less, and even though it seems like he was trying to cover his own butt with that stuff, it seemed like it might have put him in more danger.
And that would make sense on why maybe the contract for him was so expensive, $90,000, because he had some very dangerous information that he was holding on to.
So if you remember back in the 90s, there was a show called Unsolved Mysteries that was my favorite show.
Whoop,
and
whoop.
They talk about a lot of these weird cases that had never been solved or had been, had some weird aspects to them.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually broadcast this story on one of their episodes. Just 3 months after that, a man named Doug Johnston was found shot to death in his car outside of Phoenix.
That doesn't sound like it's connected. You're like, oh, well, a guy got shot in his car. But it's the circumstances surrounding it that make it so tied to this case. Doug was shot behind his left ear, and he was left-handed. However, there was no gun at the scene, and there was no gun residue. But they did find a .25 caliber bullet casing. It was determined that the gun had to at least be 12 inches away from Doug when it went off. That's only a foot away from Doug.
Yeah, but you definitely couldn't really easily,
shoot yourself a foot away from behind the head. Like that's a little bit of a stretch to be able to do that.
Get rid of the gun after you've already died.
Yeah, get rid of the gun and have no residue. Like that's a little much. But no matter what, the police still ruled it a suicide. You know, when you look at Doug's life, he had a good job, a young daughter, but they still ruled this a suicide, even though it didn't seem very likely. Now, what makes this even more interesting is how it relates to Devereaux.
So, Don Devereaux actually drove a car that was almost identical to Doug Johnston's car. It was a 70s model Toyota station wagon and could have mistook one for the other. They were so close. Their addresses were actually just one digit apart as well. A lot of people, including Devereaux himself, believes that this bullet was meant for him, basically.
And they think that this was, quote, a botched job, that they accidentally killed the wrong man. Because Devereaux found out later from a source he was confident in enough to believe that there was a contract out on his life, since he knew so much about this Charles Morgan case. Now, you might think that, yeah, that fits together, but what else could there possibly be? Let me tell you, there's more.
The web got even more tangled about a year after Doug's murder when a freelance writer, Danny Castellaro, contacted Devereaux to obtain Chuck's illegal gold transaction, like information about that. But before he could actually even get this information, he was killed.
Or committed suicide.
Yeah. You know, that's a common theme here.
Yeah.
He was found in a hotel bathtub by a maid in Martinsburg, West Virginia. His wrist had been slashed about 10 to 12 times.
It's crazy.
Danny was known to be super squeamish about blood, so that kind of violent tactic for suicide would be pretty crazy. He also had bruises and he was missing fingernails, which really sounds like he put up a fight. And when the crime scene was cleaned up, the maid said there were bloody towels all over the floor, so that kind of seemed like someone was trying to clean it up. And once someone slashes their wrist, they lose blood really fast. They don't have time to clean up and meander around. Like, it happens quick. But again, it was ruled a suicide.
Isn't that crazy that the 3 men we've talked about that have been found dead, they were all ruled a suicide, even though there's this discrepancy that just doesn't add up?
Castellaro had actually told a confidant that he was getting anonymous threatening phone calls. He specifically said if he died, it was not a suicide, that it was murder, that he would not kill himself. So that adds to kind of that thought that it can't be a suicide. And he was actually wrapped up in a lot more crazy stuff than that.
Yeah. And kind of to backtrack, a thought I just had was that, you know, Devereaux said these gold and platinum trades and illicit transactions that he was doing and keeping record of were possibly the reason that he got killed. Charles Morgan, speaking of. And right here you have Castellaro asking for the illicit records. So before he got them, he wound up dead. And I just think that's kind of
someone really
quite the coincidence.
Yeah, they did not want those records to see the light of day.
And the other person who got killed might have been mistaken for Devereaux, who knew about the records. So it's all tied around these records that Charles Morgan had kept track of.
Yeah.
Furthermore, Danny Castellaro was known to be working on I don't know what you would call it, a case called the Octopus.
Basically a big conspiracy.
Yeah, where he was trying to put together pieces that may have implicated the mafia, Charles Morgan, and multiple government officials, where they were possibly having an international type of scandal dealing with espionage, illegal trade,
spying, right?
Spying was part of it, but it was incorporating nations supposedly from all over the world, and even our own government officials were involved, including the CIA. So it was some deep stuff with some very big people, which we keep coming back around to in this case. You got the mafia and you've got the government, and that's some scary stuff when you get involved with it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like the CIA doesn't have a history of covering up things like this, so it's really, really kind of scary.
And all of the records he had collected for this octopus were never found after his death.
So there again, the paper trail.
People wiping it clean, erasing their footprints. To this day, Devereaux is still alive, but the murderer of Morgan and Johnston and Casolaro, if he was murdered, they were never found. Obviously, it being ruled a suicide, they weren't looking for any murderers. The cases were considered closed. So whoever did these things, they're still walking if these things were done by another person. The theories on this can go on for ever. There's so many different conspiracies about what might have happened, what they might have been involved in. Some people just think that it was drugs and it's just a coincidence that this guy, was here at this time, or this guy committed suicide, or things like that. But when you start connecting the dots, things get a little bit more intricate.
Yeah, because I can see how you would think, if you just look at Charles Morgan, you see the things that happen. I can see how you would be like, okay, well, maybe he was just crazy. Maybe he was on drugs. Maybe he just snapped and made all this stuff up in his head. But then you think about the other players, the phone calls from the Green Eyes, the subsequent suicides, quote unquote. It's
so complex.
When you look at it from a whole, how can you just see that little piece of the case,
Exactly.
So one thing I didn't really read anything about online, but I kind of just thought of was, how Ecclesiastes 12 was kind of such a cryptic part of the case that didn't really fit in. You couldn't really pinpoint anything about it to say, this makes sense in this setting.
Yeah, very awkwardly there.
So I was kind of channeling my inner, National Treasure and
Da Vinci Code.
Yeah. And thinking, what if it was some kind of code? Like, what if there was some kind of key somewhere and that was their, I don't know what they call it, when they have like a book or something and it says this line in this letter or this line in this word. Yeah. And you put it
like
together.
Like a hidden message.
Yeah. So I was thinking, I wonder if that's kind of a bigger part of it than anyone really realized.
Yeah. Also, when you read the Ecclesiastes, it's kind of misleading because to me, I feel like it sounded like something you would leave for suicide or kind of like an explanation to why things are ending is what it sounds like when you're reading the passage. Yeah. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily mean that to be in the Bible, but that's what it sounds like if Charles Morgan was trying to leave that, but nothing adds up to really say this was a suicide.
Yeah. And even there, the woman calling in and also saying Ecclesiastes 12, that just adds another layer to it, because if he did sort of mean it in that, like things are coming to an end, or like he didn't want to have to go through the later stages of life or something like that, where does this woman come in?
Yeah.
And one other theory I'll throw in there, even though I think it's pretty far-fetched when you look at the whole case, is I actually read that some people think that Charles' wife was behind everything.
Ooh.
Yeah. So some people think she's the one that got the call. She's the one that was nursing him back to health. They never called the police. So it was kind of her word. Like, all of that was just her word.
Yeah.
And some people think she sort of orchestrated that whole thing, made it up, and killed him herself.
Wow. I wouldn't have thought about that. I'm sure the police might, well, maybe not. Because I was thinking, maybe the police would have looked into her. They usually look at the spouse first, but if they automatically thought it was a suicide from the autopsy, why would they look at anybody?
She could have been behind the whole thing, sort of pulling the strings and just coming off as the spouse of this man who's either crazy or involved in some really big things beyond kind of her comprehension. So I don't know if I really buy into that one myself, but it's pretty interesting to think about.
Yeah, I love far-fetched conspiracies, even if they don't seem accurate.
Yeah.
This was by far one of my favorite cases we've looked at so far, and I thought it was a great one. Thank you guys for listening in. And we hope that you check in with us next time. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you can go ahead and get all of our new podcast episodes when they come out. And if you want to, go follow us on Instagram at The Abyss Pod. You can also like us on Facebook for The Abyss. You can go visit our website, theabysspod.com, where we'll be putting up a whole bunch of information about the case.
Yeah, and we have pictures of the $2 bill that was found and
yeah,
things
so
like
if you're curious about that, go check it out.
Thanks. We'll see you next time.
Erasing their footprint.
Fuck, what did I say before?
Cryptic code. Tom Hanks.
That's super weird. Other countries, such as Southeast Asia.
Not a country. Members from the Banano.
Banano? Banano. Banano.
You never know.